Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Isselhardt, a public historian specializing in researching and interpreting childhood. Specifically, I focus on the study of girlhood throughout all time periods. I've worked with lots of museums, and in the past decade, I've discovered that girlhood, and childhood in general, are much more diverse, complex, and interesting than most scholars tend to believe. Today, we're talking about childhood in the Age of Revolutions. Let's start with a basic question. What is the Age of Revolution? The Age of Revolution is used to define the 75-year period between 1775 and 1848, a time when many nations underwent social, political, or economic revolutions that produced the modern world. These included the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Irish Rebellion, and the Haitian Revolution, among many others. These events felt like a wave of change to contemporaries. When one revolution seemed to end, another began, spreading ideas about freedom and human rights across the globe. There was also a broader revolution, the Industrial Revolution, but that in itself is an entire class, as the rise of factories led to mass urbanization and new inventions radically changed notions of labor, class mobility, and transportation. So the Age of Revolutions is really a period where we see Enlightenment and Protestant ideas peak into a general movement towards a better life, whatever that meant to each person. It was essentially a challenge to the established order, and children were part of, witnessed to, and affected by that challenge. So, how did children participate in revolutions? Children were part of revolutions in numerous ways, and none more public than in becoming revolutionaries themselves or supporting revolutionary family members' activities. In the American Revolution, one girl recently brought back to historical attention is Sybil Ludington. On April 26, 1777, 16-year-old Sybil was at her New York home when her father, a colonel, was alerted that 2,000 British troops were marching for neighboring Danbury to destroy the Continental Army's supplies. Needing to remain at their home as the center of command, the colonel sent Sybil on a midnight ride that blew Paul Revere out of the water. In less than 12 hours, Sybil rode across 40 miles of rugged, dark roads from what is now Kent to Carmel, Mahopac, Kent Cliffs, and Stormville, New York, calling the militia to arms. Though they did not reach Danbury in time, the troops did meet the British Army for the Battle of Ridgefield, dealing a major blow to British forces. Sybil returned home, having evaded capture by the British Army. Paul Revere was captured, and riding twice the distance of Paul Revere at just 16. Very little is known about her life afterwards, other than that she married and operated a tavern in Catskill, New York. Today, roadside signs and local legend are what preserve her story, and historians typically tossed her aside as a mere figment of imagination. But recent research shows that she was a real person and that her ride happened. A ride that made Paul Revere look, quite frankly, like a sorry excuse for a soldier. Another American child involved in revolution was future President Andrew Jackson. Born in 1767, Jackson was a young child as the American Revolution took hold of the nation. His family had recently immigrated from Ireland, and his father died shortly after he was born. Raised in the frontier region of the Carolinas, Jackson's extended family were Scotch-Irish. Having immigrated to escape centuries of persecution by the English, they were practically bleeding revolutionary fervor before it gripped the nation as a whole. The Revolutionary War was part of Jackson's childhood. When he was only 13, Jackson joined the fight against the British. His brothers also joined. By 1791, one had died, while Jackson and his brother Robert were captured by the British. In captivity, Jackson's rebellious spirit continued, earning him physical punishments, and he contracted smallpox. The disease prompted the British to agree to release the boys as part of a prisoner exchange, but soon after, Robert died, leaving Jackson the only child remaining in the family. He accompanied his mother to Charleston, where she soon died of cholera. Jackson was just 14 and now an orphan. His story was common of the Revolution, as war, no matter the time period, often leaves many orphans. Jackson's life was never truly normal after this. Though he was able to live with extended relatives and attended school, even trying to become a lawyer, Jackson ended his childhood by leaving it all behind for the wilderness road, riding into a life of adventure, war, and fiery politics. Like so many other pioneers who moved west, the American Revolution had profoundly changed Jackson's sense of family, stability, and expectations of life. Across the Atlantic, France found itself in revolution as well. Begun in 1789, Paris soon saw the rise of patriotic gangs of children who brandished weapons and acted out battles in the city streets. Why were these children play fighting? Well, beyond the aspects of play, the French Revolution was the first time that many youth, especially those of lower social status who lacked professions or wealth, felt powerful. Like other revolutions, the French Revolution inspired deep patriotism in all ages, spurring the creation of child gangs. And these gangs didn't just play act. There are records that indicate their activities resulted in numerous casualties. As Dr. Julia Gossard of Utah State University wrote, in the San Savoie neighborhood, a child maimed another with an iron axe, causing the child to lose an eye. Pamphlets published as child gangs grew show a deep concern over the possibility of encouraging an entire generation of violence. Pamphlet writers asked mothers to morally educate their children, adhering to the belief that childhood should be a time of innocence and nurturing that ingrained patriotic sentiments without inciting violence. Notably, pamphlets reveal that it was a mother's duty to educate their sons, blaming the countless injured children on neglectful mothers that failed to fulfill their natural gendered duties to protect and educate their children in proper conduct, behavior, and patriotism. Quite a task when society was being radically upended. However, the vast majority of children were likely witnesses rather than participants in revolutions. So, what did children witness during revolutions? One witness to revolution were the many free and enslaved children of Haiti. Begun in 1791, the Haitian Revolution was a slave insurrection that succeeded in outing French colonial rule and establishing the nation's independence, cementing Haiti as the only slave uprising that led to the founding of a state that was both free from slavery and ruled by non-whites. While the Haitian Revolution had profound effects throughout the world, it was most intensely felt by the island's children, who bore witness to horrific violence, murder, and the adjustment to freedom. Amelia Hinson, a doctoral candidate at the University of Miami, detailed how the Haitian Revolution left many children orphaned and created a system of informal adoption, where children were moved between the homes of relatives and friends when parents' resources were limited. Some children were also sent to the cities, working for middle and upper class families in exchange for education. Unfortunately, by the mid-20th century, this system had become abused. As the standard of living fell in rural areas following U.S. occupation, more children went to work in cities, and their conditions deteriorated to slave-like conditions. According to a 1998 UNICEF report, an estimated 300,000 children, that's 10% of Haiti's children, lived in these conditions, performing backbreaking labor, suffering harsh treatment, and seldom attending school as had been promised. Though the pace of change for children in Haiti seemed good at first, it later reverted back to conditions that the revolution had sought to end. Haitian childhood changed dramatically due to the revolution, and its legacies remain today. But how did childhood change as a result of the other revolutions? Turning back to France and the French Revolution, we find the last royal French children, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte de France and the former Dauphin, Louis Charles, the surviving children of Queen Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI. They spent their childhood in court, but it was interrupted in 1789, when Marie-Thérèse was 11 and Louis Charles was 4. During the first few years of the Revolution, the children remained with their parents, until, in 1792, they were locked in the Temple prison. Within a year, both parents had been executed, and the children were living locked up. Louis Charles became the contested heir, as France struggled to decide whether the monarchy should endure. He was cared for by shoemaker Antoine Simon, whose chief aim was to make the young prince renounce his royal origins. Given Louis's age, this was relatively easy. Simon managed to get Louis to testify against his own mother at her trial, which enabled the court to find Marie Antoinette guilty of incest and sentence her to death. For the next 2 years, Louis lived in a filthy jail cell, dying of tuberculosis at the age of 10. Marie-Thérèse was the last surviving child, learning of her family's deaths and the deaths of her extended kin while still in jail. On the walls of her cell are engraved, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte is the most unhappy person in the world. She can obtain no news of her mother, nor be reunited to her, though she has asked it 1,000 times. Live, my good mother, whom I love well, but of whom I can hear no tidings. O my Father, watch over me from heaven above. O my God, forgive those who have made my parents suffer. At age 17, she was released as part of negotiations with the Austrian army and sent to live in exile in Vienna and later what is now Latvia. Her experiences of witnessing the resentment and anger of the French people, the executions of her family, the defamatory pamphlets about them, and imprisonment for much of her teenage years are what she carried with her. They were compounded by an unhappy marriage that was reportedly never consummated, leaving her a bitter, angry woman who spent her life caring for remaining family, witnessing their deaths, and dying alone in exile at the age of 72, 3 days after the 58th anniversary of her mother's execution. While Marie Therese' story is perhaps one of the more tragic of royals after revolution, it embodied their realities. The pain of losing loved ones, the anger of being exiled suddenly from the privileged life they knew, and the uncertainty of never truly having a place to call home. In contrast, the young Dauphine suffered a shorter, tragic fate, but perhaps one that in death spared him the pain of years in exile. Their experiences were unique due to their previous status as royalty, but their pain, anger, and uncertainty were common threads with children around the world who bore witness to, participated in, and whose lives were profoundly changed by the Age of Revolution. That's our brief look into different experiences of childhood during the Age of Revolution. Thanks, y'all.